Yeah, so this is really a presentation from the REMET project. So I have several quarters. I couldn't fit them in the top, but I have a slide later to really acknowledge their work. They did basically the bulk of the data collection, and they helped me with the data analysis also of at the various levels. So really my hat here is as the head of the methodology coordination group, as we call it within REMET. Basically, we're carrying out the parts that integrate work packages and that where we have data collection and analysis that cuts across the whole project. So that's a bit my role, helped also by Abi Tocha, my colleague at the University of Agder, and we work together with the Navarra team. So there's Mercedes, Arkan, and Deborah also working on that. And again, this is really a massive effort with everybody else then really doing the work on the ground. So what we're doing today, we're starting with some provisional findings. Really now we finished the first part of the data collection. So these are provisional findings that we're putting together from that. And it's a two-part presentation really. Today I'm going to focus a little bit more on the academic parts. Tomorrow, for those of you who are here, and if you are, I strongly recommend you follow that. We have basically, we will present the main points for a policy brief that we're working on that is almost ready, that basically proceeds more with the policy implication of what I'm starting here. So see this almost as two parts of the same project. I think this is, yep, I got it. Okay, thanks. The DSA in brief, I'm not going to talk too much about it because we already had enough sessions now. So this is really just to frame our work. We know there is a bold regulative initiative and probably the first transnational regulation for social media platforms and search engines, at least of this size and reach. It has due diligence obligations with FT fines. Perhaps that's also what's part. It's got some teeth when and if it is applied. And if, of course, it's got very differential levels of obligation. So the highest burden that is relevant to our project is really on very large online platform, very large search engines. From an academic point of view, I think what's more interesting from us is that especially the preambles part contain a really sophisticated thinking on the latest literature on the negative effects of algorithms. So you have issues like dark patterns, micro-targeting, recommender systems, content moderation, highlighted in quite some depth. I think that, from an academic point of view, to me, is something very positive and definitely a change from previous regulation, both in the EU and elsewhere. There are two categories of the various systemic risks that I think are very relevant for our data collection and analysis. One is the harming fundamental rights. So really here is the really thorny balance between protecting freedom of expression, but also protecting groups from harm. And in the kind of work we do on disinformation and very hot political topics, we're really talking about hate speech, among other things. And the second part that I think is connected to the first, it's really the negative effects that these platforms can have on democracy more broadly, both as a discourse and as a practice. We're using Chadwick model of the hybrid media system to basically, already accepted by now, this is becoming quite common. It is one integrated media system. Even talking too much about this separation between traditional and new media is making less and less sense. These media are not that new anymore. And, Jeffrey also made a point that even alternative media are not necessarily that alternative anymore. And what we did, we came up with this quite experimental method that is still ongoing. I will explain how it will continue after what we're presenting today, that we call mini ethnographies. We already had a couple of presentations on this from the more country level data. I think Thales and Niklas presented on that, and there will be others throughout the day. Basically, our participants were 17 professional journalists, 15 alternative and community media content producers, basically people who might see themselves controversially as journalists, not all of them, but they are not professionally trained. So, but we know that that's very contested from both sides. But in general, people who produce other media. By alternative and community, we also mean that they are not all anti-establishment. Many of these media are actually complementary. They don't see themselves necessarily against, but we did add in the sample more anti-establishment kind of media, both from left and right. And then we also interviewed and worked with 16 citizens who actually use the media that these other two categories produce and distribute. We covered 8 European countries: Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Spain, and United Kingdom. So European, not EU, so it's EU plus, but we think that Europe is broader than the EU. And the fieldwork was carried out between April and December 2024. So we're pretty fresh. Now it's really when we're getting into the thickness of the analysis. they are not really long-term ethnographies. I'm an anthropologist, so to call something an ethnography, you have to stay with the same people for at least 12 months, probably more. What we call them, that's why we call them mini, we're taking an ethnographic orientation. So we go close to participants, we interacted with them in their everyday work or usage settings. If they were citizens, we did some participant observations of their practices, both of production, distribution, and consumption of media. And the interviews we did were basically unstructured and open-ended. They were led by participants concerned. We also had an interesting part of visual ethnography where we asked participants to actually depict to us in snapshots what they think was relevant for these interviews and this process. The researchers, who are basically my co-authors of this and more work that we're doing together, did data collection and country-level data analysis. We then also did, because ethnographies are quite dialogic, so the data analysis is very much a conversation. First was the people in the country teams, and then the country teams had a dialogue meeting with me, more kind of analysis meetings, and I'm now developing the more pan-European analysis on top of those country-level analysis. Of course, when we say country, we don't really mean that we're studying countries representatively. We just mean that the fieldwork was carried out in these 8 countries. What was perhaps really interesting also for future work is that we started a bit more with the idea of countries in REMED, but actually the similarities of the challenges and the resonances across the 8 countries were pretty striking. Not to say that there were not differences, of course, but this exercise really showed us, there was one major finding that we will develop further, that there is a European media system, so to speak, at least in terms of the challenges and the practices that are occurring there. It might not be still very much structured in a regulatory way, or the DSA hopefully, of course, tries to do that. But it was quite striking to see how the country context did not completely change what the main concerns of participants were. I think that was really interesting, especially from an ethnographer point of view. We tend to talk a lot about local context. In this case, there was something more happening. We worked on 6 themes. One was really democracy and democratic media, toxic news, human-media technology relations is what we call as our innovation in theoretical terms. I'll talk a little bit more if there's time later. We worked also on the worldviews and the professionalization and the identity and agency parts, so these producers especially, political economy and regulatory framework, that's where the DSA came. And also we did a little bit about Gen AI. It's not really a big part of our project, but it was important for us to just gauge where people were with this, given that it happened while we had already kind of started the project. So it wasn't really an interview template, but we did put some issues and told the interviewers basically to say, you can improvise quite a bit, please follow the participants. And of course, inevitably, because we were not aiming to be structured, some teams came up with quite different concerns from others. So that's really one thing. What we will do in the next phase that is starting in these weeks, we're now going to scale this up and make it more structured, and we're going to do more in-depth semi-structured interviews with the same template across these countries. But a lot of the template that we're using now follows directly from the findings of here. And we're also recruiting completely new participants, so we'll have more data, but also we don't exhaust, kind of burn out these very kind participants who spent quite a lot of time with us. Basically, we had the minimum of 2 longish interviews per participant and 1 what we call participant observation session, where we will actually look at the practices. So it's quite substantial data if you put it together. I don't have time to read all the names, otherwise my minutes are gone, but this is just to say a big thank you. So this was really a team effort, and you can see how many, I don't know, I haven't counted, but we're probably 20 plus researchers working on this. So this is really good from the 8 countries and institutions that are part of REMED, the academic institution. There's also the European Federation of Journalists who's helping us a lot on the policy and dissemination side. So just to give you an example of the variety, so this would be an alternative media producer from the Czech Republic. Again, I did not carry out the ethnography myself, so I'm not going to claim to know Czech, but from what I understood from Katerina, who did that, so this is some kind of collage of some old anti-communist themes about freedom. There's perhaps some racialization there, or this innocent white child there. In any case, this was one extreme of the ethnographies, but this was the other. It was just a citizen in Norway innocently sharing, funny things about, well, in Norway we're a bit noise, aware, so my dog can't bark, and so, if there is a thief coming in, then the dog has to just sit and watch. So this was just to give a very little pill of the variety and diversity of what was going on there. And I think that is really the variety and fragmentation and diversity of the current media landscape. There's all kinds of things happening online. It's not just, on one side or another. And emerging, and I've really used the word emerging clearly here, it's really more a heuristic now. It's not that theoretically developed, but following the ethnographic approach, we're trying to do data-driven theory. We're basically saying that regulation needs to interact. So an understanding of regulation, in this case the DSA, needs to interact with at least 3 areas that are at least relevant to what we can contribute. We don't think this is exhaust the whole of the DSA, but we think that's what we can really contribute with our more in-depth social knowledge. There's democracy on one side, society and technology. And I'll share some very brief findings from here, more as a kind of summary notes at the moment. Democracy, I think I'm not going to repeat it much because it came up very clearly from the presentation this morning. We basically have very varied views of what democracy even is. So one major problem both for us for understanding and what we'll explore tomorrow for policymakers, making an assumption that we all agree on what liberal democracy or even democracy should be, it's problematic. When, the data clearly shows us something else. One example, but there were really many. An Irish journalist, for instance, complained of a centre-right bias on mainstream journalism, while another alternative media person in Belgium was very much anti-woke and left-wing conspiracy. So these were completely different views of what's going on. But even on the more nuanced side, some people really asked for more audience engagement, and others said that's a problem. We are doing too much clickbait. So that's really one of the issues that we need to deal with as researchers. How do we deal with this variety? And here we're going to work more also through the analysis and the next phase. How do we balance a more agonistic approach where we don't kind of quash these conflicts, to talk with Dish and Muffe, but at the same time maintain focus on some normative boundaries? And I think that's really where the more radical democracy school might have some issues. So we still need some normative boundaries, but we also need some kind of agonism. So I think this is a very difficult balance that both academics and policymakers and activists and civil society is dealing with. The technology part, one brief finding, really our goal is to bring these human-technology relations much more nuanced into journalism studies. What we saw is that basically it's not enough to be aware of algorithms. So yes, people are aware, some people, of the negative effects of algorithms, but that doesn't seem to lead to different practices. And the other issue from toxic news, toxic media, is that actually what we're seeing, that some people are disconnecting or hugely reducing their engagement, which again, it could be one way to resist, or it could be problematic if it means pulling out of a really important public sphere. Finally, on society, what we're seeing here is the crystallization of social and political identities. And I think these are findings that you'll find in a lot of literature. Of course, it's contested as all these findings. I have some level of politics, but it would confirm basically that you can't look at democracy without looking basically at the different social and political identities fighting there. And that explains a lot of the diversity and even clashes. One issue that came up from many, it's really that mainstream journalists got an issue of representation. And I think this came up also with previous presentations, so I'm not going to do it too much. And another interesting trend is that also people in the alternative community media space are seeing their media as activism, also to address this lack of representation or these inequalities in representation. Finally, and this is something really that I'm going to explore tomorrow in more depth with the policy brief. So what did the actors really know about the DSA? Almost nothing. That is a very important finding for policymakers that we will deal with tomorrow. And these were professional journalists with decades of experience, the media producers who've been there in the space, some were highly educated citizens, yet they would know about the DSA, they would have heard of it, but they couldn't really say what the content was about. There was widespread skepticism about regulation in general. That's another big danger. The freedom of speech as seen as incompatible with regulation argument is becoming really dominant, well beyond far-right views or more populist anti-establishment views. That's a very important finding. And many people who were in favor of regulation, probably the majority, they felt quite defensive. They always had to qualify their position. Well, we need to regulate, but we need to watch out for this and that. So clearly here, the EU and the civil society needs to put a counter-offensive to one view that is basically becoming dominant. And I think the presentations this morning already clarified some of the more theoretical issues around that. Another really worrying findings at the level of policy is really that many people see hate speech as normal. Not that they endorse it, but they were not surprised. They were almost surprised by the fact that we're surprised, or that, policymakers are so concerned. They saw it as a normal feature, they deal in their own way, so what? So that's another really important thing that could really potentially affect the democratic potentials of this space. Next steps, tomorrow presentations, I will focus more on the policy implications and recommendations. We're now preparing an edited book proposal, so we will have much more in-depth country level work that then kind of relates to each other in the more bigger editorial introduction. And the current phase, as I said, we're going to interview 30 professional journalists and 30 alternative and community media producers. The country sample is a bit smaller just for efficiency reasons. So we're working in 6 countries, and the citizens will be studied in 2 countries only, it's Ireland and Belgium. So this is mostly to do also with REMAD and the structure of deliverables. But basically, we're continuing on these 3 key actors, and we're now focusing very clearly on the comparison between those 2 types of producers. Thank you.